We're here today with Dacia Inman, the mother of 15-year-old twins, Georgia and Patterson, who are the only living heirs of Doris Duke, the richest woman in the world in her time. And we're going to hear about the struggles that she's had with the court system and with all the people that have tried to get their hands on the money, a total of $1 billion potentially, that these kids will get when they're 21 years old, if the money lasts, because right now she's been through over a decade of struggles, just first to get her children, these sole heirs, but then also to protect their interests and to even know what's happening in the trusts and with the trustees involved with all of this vast amount of money. It's a case about corruption, and it's a very troubling saga that we're going to talk about today, and some questions and answers. But first, Dacia wants to make kind of a thank you to Rolling Stone magazine, who did a full spread expose about what they called the poorest rich kids in the world.
Thank you, Anne. I want to give special thanks to the Rolling Stone magazine and award-winning investigative reporter Sabrina Rubin Erdely for doing the Inman story. On August 1st, 2013, the Rolling Stone magazine exposed criminals for over a decade of crime and corruption, child abuse, and maltreatment of the Inman children. So many, for over a decade, tried to keep the horrible truth about what they did from being told. Words cannot express the family's gratitude for finally letting the truth be known. The conversation has now begun. The focus is now on the who, why, and how this happened.
Is there anything else you want to say about the Rolling Stones interview, Dacia? About how you feel about it?
Yes. My children and I are very disappointed because it did not go into the who, how, and why this happened.
Why are you doing this interview today?
I'm here to expose the criminals that are still in my children's lives. And to do that, I have to ask the public for help.
And how could your children be abused and damaged for so many years without any of the authorities stepping in?
Corruption, no due process. My children were prevented from access to mental health treatment and evaluations.
Now, there's a record of the court ordering an evaluation of your children, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us about that?
That's only after I did a civil protest and handed out flyers outside the Teton County Courthouse. And that's when the court had no choice but to order evaluations on my children. The fraud and conspiracy against my children continued for years, over a 5-year extension until the death of my children's father. Criminals illegally prevented those evaluations and treatment of my children with the court's assistance.
So how did the court assist these criminals, as you call them?
The court allowed the criminals to prevent the evaluations and mental health treatment for my children to prevent discovery of the crimes committed against my children for over a decade. The public can review all of the evidence of the judicial reviews and the court cases. I started a website, and it is called the Inman Corruption Files.
And what was the result of the courts not allowing mental health evaluations and treatment of your children?
They never got help. They continued to be damaged. They were held prisoners on a mountaintop, which is in Grover, Wyoming, where that is the house where they lived. Their abusers kept them from their doctors in helping them. And my children from having a voice against their abusers.
Why didn't the GAL, the guardian ad litem or guardian ad litems, protect your kids?
Corruption. She had evidence for years on the crimes against my children and who was responsible. My children say their father was paying her a lot of money to keep from getting my children help.
And how was this attorney John Bowers involved?
Oh my God, John D. Bowers. This is perhaps the most dangerous criminal holding a law license imaginable. This person organized crimes against my children with the help of the 3 times convicted felon stepmother. They defrauded my children and the courts to hide their abuse and maltreatment. They said these criminals threatened my children if they said anything, they would be killed. The evidence against the criminals, John D. Bowers, is so overwhelming. The public has to see it to believe it. This is the same person that hid my children's father, was incompetent, created a will and a trust, documents in his office that he made my children's father sign with only his family as witnesses, leaving everything to the attorney to do with as if it was his own. This person and the stepmother has sold off and exploited the children's inheritance and refused to give any accounting. And this is the same criminal that abused my children, exploited their father's estate, that trustees, J.P. Morgan and Citibank, funded tens of millions with no oversight or accounting.
How was the stepmother involved with John D. Bowers?
This is an incestuous pool of special interest, and everyone involved want to prevent discovery of their involvement in what happened to my children for over a decade. And the evidence can be seen, again, on my site, the Inman corruption files.
And so the stepmother was represented by John D. Bowers for what, to begin with?
He represented her in drug crimes involving my children. He would hide the crimes from the family court by fraud. The attorney even committed child medical fraud that could have resulted in the death of my little girl, Georgia. And you can see that evidence and affidavit of the children's doctor, Dr. Noel Steiber.
Okay. What happened after the children's father died?
The criminals, John D. Bowers and Darrell Inman, the stepmother, tried to keep control of my children so they could not testify against them.
Is that same attorney, or isn't the same attorney involved in the children's father's estate?
Absolutely, yes, that's John D. Bowers.
And why can't the children get it funding from their trust for legal counsel at least?
It's because the children's trustees, J.P. Morgan and Citibank, are associated with the criminals, John D. Bowers and Darrell Inman, their stepmother. If the trustees release funding for my children to have counsel to protect themselves and the Walker Patterson Inman Jr. estate and trust, there will be discovery of their involvement in funding of the criminals.
So what's going on now in the Walker P. Inman Jr. estate and trust out of Wyoming?
What's going on now is my children need funding now before statutes of limitations run out on their right to go after their criminals that damaged them, abused them, and their father's estate and trust. If my children do not get funding for their attorney, Matt Bremner, my children could lose their right to recover tens of millions that was lost in family treasures, inheritance misappropriated, and stolen by criminals.
If you had funding for lawyers or attorneys for your children, what would you have those people do, those attorneys do?
I would give my children's attorney, Matt Bremner, the money he needs to go after the criminals responsible for crimes against my children and their father's estate. I would let him go after the corruption in Wyoming involving the GALs and the courts, I would allow my children the right to bring their trustees before the courts in removal proceedings.
So some issues of the children's father's competence have come up over the many years, is that right?
Yes. I believe the evidence shows my children's father was incompetent for years, and he was being taken advantage of by persons around him. The testimony of my children and court documents show this to be true. One of the persons that took advantage of Walker, my children's father, was the attorney, John D. Bowers, and others. The attorney, John D. Bowers, created a will and trust and had a person, which is Walker Inman, children's father, with diminished capacity, sign the documents at his office with only his family as witnesses. The document said all kinds of bizarre stuff and gave the attorney control over everything as if it was his own. That's what the documents say. The attorney represented Walker as a person of diminished capacity in a case with a former personal manager that stole millions in personal and real property, taking advantage of a drug addict that was incompetent for over a 20-year period of time. My children's father was so bad, he had to give the third party power of attorney over his life and personal affairs. Walker overdosed many times, and the attorney committed fraud to hide it for years as he took advantage of Walker being a person of diminished capacity, waiting for him to die so he could take everything my children's father had. All over the country, this attorney, John D. Bowers and Darrell Lee Inman, sold off millions from the estate and trust, and they refuse still to this day to give up any accounting on the estate and trust. I would like the public to come forward with information on everything that these two criminals sold off from February 2010 to the present date.
So have the children's attorneys in the Walker Inman estate or attorney, has anyone been paid? Has an attorney been paid, an attorney for the kids?
J.P. Morgan and Citibank are involved with the same criminals that abused my children and exploited their estate. Any litigation in my children's estate would include accounting, and that would lead right back to the tens of millions that the trustees funded criminals for over a decade with no oversight or accounting. So it would also show that the trustees knew that my children's father was a lifelong drug addict, that the stepmother, Darrell Inman, was a lifelong drug addict. That was persons of diminished capacity. The trustees never protected the trusts, and they also made millions off of funding.
So how are your children being protected with no funding to pay for legal counsel?
Representatives are doing what they can with no money, but anyone knows without funding for counsel, a litigant is vulnerable. Trustees have even told my children's counsel if they settle the case with no litigation, they would fund, but not if they took any action against the criminals. The trustees have tried to influence the Walker Patterson Inman Jr. estate and trust case to prevent any discovery of accounting and information about what they knew about Walker being a person of diminished capacity. The felon stepmother, Darrell Inman, and the tens of millions funded the drug addicts with no oversight or accounting, and the trustees knew that my children's father was a person of diminished capacity but did nothing to protect the trust from being exploited by people taking advantage of my children's father, Walker Inman Jr.
So why not forget the past and move on?
My children and I would love to. But the criminals are still in bed with my children. We are not allowed to move on because we are still fighting this horrific nightmare.
Do you feel your children are in any kind of danger now, Daisha?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell us about that, please?
With this Wyoming case still going on with my children's estate and trust, this is surrounded with all of the criminals. They're in danger until this is settled, and until my children are safe, they're in grave danger.
Are you angry?
You damned right I'm angry. I am very angry with what the judicial system has allowed to happen to my children, the GALs, the abusers, the nannies that have abused my children. I'm like one pissed off mama bear that is out to protect her cubs. These criminals know who they are. They know that I know who they are, and they know that my children know who they are. My children has named names. Janice Warner and Randy Warner. Their stepmother, Darrell Inman, her sister, Cheryl Steinhausen, her brother, Kenny Steinhausen, her mother, Rosemary Steinhausen, Kippy Johnson, Lane Hutchings, and many, many others. Janet Burrows. We've got John Connor, Connie Hunter. You know who you are, and you know I will never give up until you are arrested and prosecuted and thrown in prison for what you have done to my babies. And I will stop at nothing until these bastards are thrown into prison.
Thank you, Daisha. That's all I have.
Thank
You're very courageous.